I'm off to Kathmandu. Do join me. The receptionist at my Ipanema hotel in Rio hardly looked up from his desk as he began the customary admonitions. Make sure to use the double lock on your door, sir, and don't take any valuables with you to the beach, sir, and don't hail taxis on the street, sir. Use the hotel service. Well, thank you, I said. Thank you very much. And would you like to join tonight's Candomblé tour? Candomblé? It's the favela tour, sir, but tonight it includes a Candomblé ceremony. People go into trances, he added, helpfully. Well, trances, eh? Well, I duly did the tour, and through the unglazed window of a half-constructed favela house I watched women dressed in long white gowns chanting and indeed falling into what looked like semi-conscious states. For no more than a second, one of the entranced women gazed in my direction and made fleeting eye contact. Was she, I thought indulgently, slyly repelling my tourist gaze? Well, I remembered that ambiguous moment as I was reading a new research paper in the journal Geoforum with the title Empowering the Empowered? Slum Tourism and the Depoliticisation of Poverty. This author, who's now with me in the studio, is Melissa Nisbet, who's Senior Lecturer in the Department of Culture at King's College, London. Now, Melissa, you were looking at studying tourism. You were looking at a so-called slum tour in Mumbai, formerly Bombay. First question, really, before we get into your real research, I mean, how did the residents take to being the object of this tourist gaze?
I'm not really sure. I think my answer would be largely indifferent. I think there's a gap in the research when it comes to resident perceptions of slum tourism. But from what I could glean from the tour that I went on, the tour was met with seeming indifference. There was no hostility, but nor was there much tension.
How many of these tours might go through in a single day? Is there any idea?
Well, they're 6 hours in duration, and around 15,000 people go to the slum every year. So visitors will be there every day, so it might be a common sight. But yeah, people were just going about their business, not really paying much attention to what we were doing.
Now here you are talking about something called slum tourism, and I imagine there are many people listening who haven't any idea what slum tourism amounts to. I mean, first of all, what do you mean? What counts as a slum?
Okay, so the United Nations would define a slum as somewhere where people have insecure residential status, and what they mean by that is that people don't hold any legal title to their property, they don't have any legal right to the land that it sits on, and these are places where people are experiencing multiple deprivations. So that might be overcrowding, poor sanitation, it might be lack of clean water, it could be inadequate access to basic services like healthcare.
I hadn't realised until I read your book. I suppose at the back of my mind I knew about Victorian people going in Victorian times to look at the slums and bring back news of what was going on. I mean, that's really where slum tours started.
Yeah, it has quite a long history. So there's a great book, actually, by an American historian called Seth Coven, and he plots the history and the origins of what he calls slumming. And he says that the first slum tours took place in London in Victorian times, where wealthy people who lived in places like Belgravia and Mayfair took these midnight buses to the East End of London to look at slums and the people that lived in slums. And he says that at this point people were curious, but largely people were going to slums because they wanted entertainment and titillation. And it wasn't until quite a bit later that people started to develop more social consciences, and you'd get slum visits from philanthropists or social reformers or doctors. But then the current incarnation of slum tourism is quite different. So this refers to tours that are highly organised and slickly packaged and marketed, and it's where people in what we might call problematically as the global north go into the global south to look upon impoverished communities.
Give me a little bit picture, because the slum you visited, I think, is called Dharavi in Mumbai. What about this slum? I mean, the origins, who lives there, what sort of place is it?
Okay, so in terms of size, it's a plot of land that's just under 2 kilometres square, And we can roughly think about that as being half the size of Central Park in New York. But it's populated by 1 million people, which makes it about 6 times as populous, as dense as daytime Manhattan. So it's really overcrowded. But it's been there for a long time. It's been there since the late 1800s. And it's a result of British colonialism. So originally, Mumbai was 7 different islands that became joined over time because of trading. And when the British colonial government took control of that area, they built these, they went into the suburbs and they expanded. And that pushed people northwards. So
extraordinary, as you point out in your thing, an extraordinary growth of slums around the world. I mean, this is supposed to be, I think this is supposed to be Asia's largest slum?
It's supposedly Asia's largest slum, and it's 1 million people. But this is a huge problem. Around 1 billion people globally live in slums, and that number is set to rise to possibly 3 billion by 2030. So this is a massive and growing problem.
It's a nice story of how your research got started, because you yourself, you were on a work trip to India, and you actually went on one of these tours sponsored by Reality Tours, I think the biggest tour operator there. Then you decided to turn the visit into a piece of research. What nudged you in that direction?
Well, one of the things that I teach at King's is thanatourism or dark tourism, and this refers to sites of death or destruction or atrocity or struggle or hardship that are turned into cultural attractions. So I'm always on the lookout for these sites. And when I visit these places, I'm really interested in what stories are being told, who's telling these stories, who's listening. How do these narratives speak to broader social issues? And I went on the tour just so that I could speak to my students about it. And then I was really troubled by some of the things that I saw and some of the things that I heard. And I made on my way back to the hotel, I was making some notes about it, not to turn this into a research project, but just to make sense of it for myself. And then the next day, I got an email from the tour company inviting me to go online and to go to visit TripAdvisor and leave a review to rate my experience. And I clicked on the link and I looked at the comments. And I wasn't intending to leave a review. I just wanted to see what other people were writing. And some of the things that I'd been troubled about the day before were very much replicated in the comments. And so I ended up, when I got home, doing quite a close and quite rigorous analysis of almost 250
And of course, what was amazing comments. Was how positive these reviews were, wasn't it? I mean, here you are going through this place. I mean, you talk about what's going on here. There's a plastic recycling going on. There's an aluminium recycling shed. There's a pottery section. There are tanneries. There's smells. There's sound. There's sewage. And all of this. But at the end of it, all these people, at the end of it, produce enormously positive research. I mean, this is, I think, out of 236 reviews, nearly all were positive or very positive. And I've got here's the reading of one male visitor.
I expected to see a slum. It was most unlike a slum. It was more like a brisk business, lovely leather products at fantastic prices.
Now, one of the main themes of these reviews, they talked a lot, didn't they, about how all these people were terribly hard-working. It was an economic powerhouse. What did you make of such comments?
I wasn't particularly surprised by those comments because they replicated what we'd heard on the slum. So we start the slum by being told that the turnover of the slum is $665 million a year, and all of the tourists are really impressed by this. And I ask about what that means in relation to how many people live there, and we'd just been told that people who run businesses in the slum don't live there, and my questions were not really answered. But we were also told that there was 10,000 different factories, 10,000 different businesses operating. So I wasn't surprised by those comments, but what I was surprised by was the sort of moral subtext that came with those comments. So people talked a lot about the residents not being
scroungers,
not being dependent on welfare. They were self-sufficient. They were getting on with it. That was a key
And this enabled
trope.
them really to overlook the actual poverty that was before their eyes.
Absolutely. People didn't, as that quotation showed, people didn't seem to be able to hold these two places that somewhere could be vibrant and people could be in full employment and there could be businesses, but at the same time people could still be living in a slum.
A slightly romantic notion of community there as well. I mean, here's another reading. This time it's the words of one of the female tourists.
Friendly children smiled. The dignity of the human experience shone brightly. Neighbours watched out for each other. It was a model for the world.
Big emphasis here on community. People are happy, proud and contented. How do you interpret this version of what was before their eyes?
Yeah, well, I mean, that idea of poor but happy is something that you hear a lot and comes across through Western travel memoirs and stuff like that. But the comment that we just heard, it was that particular section, "This is a model for the world," that really got under my skin. That was the reason why I ended up writing this article, because I really felt strongly that people shouldn't be leaving this tour thinking that there isn't a problem.
Happy children, poor but happy children, was almost like a Dickensian motif, wasn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think people seem to... The only people that we interacted with on the tour were slum kids who were playing in the streets, who would come over to us and ask, "How are you? What's your name? Hello." And people seem to project all kinds of assumptions onto residents based on these very cheerful, happy, cute kids.
And you say that there's other research which shows this is the sense that other people who go around and take these slum tours come back and report the same sort of experience or same sort of sense of the place.
Yeah, absolutely. I think poor but happy is something that always comes up. And when I was talking to an Indian friend about it, she just gave me this massive eye roll.
So would you want to say then, people say, well, perhaps you shouldn't go on slum tours. I mean, they're exploitative, it's a bit voyeuristic. I mean, perhaps we should really argue that it is not an appropriate thing to do. I mean, how do you react to that?
Yeah, I mean, I deal with those criticisms quite harshly, I think, in my article, because I don't buy them. I think I've read pretty much everything that's been written on this topic, and I don't see any evidence of exploitation. And in terms of voyeurism, lots of the tour companies, so the one that I went on, 80% of the profits go back to the slum and the slum children, and they get involved in education projects like English language classes and computer courses. And so I think lots of the tour operators are operating ethically and responsibly. So
you personally find yourself able to live with their misinterpretation, if you like, of the scene?
I think the criticism that I would levy at the tour companies is that they give this really positive and upbeat picture of the slum. They completely decontextualise it, so we don't learn anything about corporate development or about the displacement of people or about social injustice. And the thing that bothers me is that we come away from those tours thinking there isn't a problem, thinking that poverty is normal and natural, and thinking that we don't have to. And at the end of the tour, actually, no one donated any money, no one bought anything from the shop.
Why not?
Because I think people didn't perceive residents to be in need. People thought that they didn't have any material wants. They were poor but happy. They were high on... People were saying things like they're high on life. They're able to find happiness in the smallest things. So I think people made all kinds of positive assumptions and concluded that these people were not in material need.
Well, there we must stop. It is a very interesting piece of research. I'm so glad you took advantage of the opportunity that tour provided. Melissa Nisbet, thank you for the moment. I remember an analogy someone once used when they were trying to describe the manner in which tourists somehow could never be in the same place as locals. And they put it this way. They said, imagine you're on a train which comes to a halt in open countryside, and you look out of the window and two men are labouring at the trackside. They're only a couple of feet away. You can see their faces, more or less understand their gestures, but they're in a different world, a world that will disappear forever as your train once again picks up speed. But the idea that one can successfully penetrate another culture, assume its characteristics, adopt its style of life, its philosophy, that idea, it is one that's always informed large parts of the tourist industry. Here, for example, is Cat Stevens, who of course was later to reappear as Yusuf Islam, hymning the delights of one culture that proved particularly enticing to Western tourists in search of new ways of life, the mystical enticement of Kathmandu.
I sit beside the dock, beneath the mire, cold, grey, dusty day, the morning lake drinks up the sky. Kathmandu, I'll soon be seeing you, and your strange, bewildering time will hold me down.
Yeah, it takes you back, doesn't it? Not necessarily to a place one wants to go. But anyway, the question is, what made this part of the world so especially attractive to Westerners longing for a utopia, a counterculture, if you like? I mean, how much did it change them when they got there, and how much did it change the locals who were there to receive them? Well, they're all questions for my next guest. He's Mark Lichty, who's Professor of Anthropology at the University of Illinois at Chicago, and he is author of a book called Far Out, Countercultural Seekers and the Tourism Encounter in Nepal. Well, Mark now joins me on the line from Chicago. Let's start off, Mark, with your own interest in Kathmandu. Where does it stem from? I think you spent some time there. You spent some time in Nepal when you were young.
That's right. I was in Nepal with my parents as a boy. My first visit was at age 9 in 1969 when my family was living on the subcontinent and had the opportunity to visit Kathmandu. And it's at that point that I saw some of the things that I later wanted to write about, because at the time I really didn't understand what I was seeing, but later became more and more fascinated.
So in a way you wanted to contrast your personal experience of the place with almost the touristic fantasy that people were bringing to bear upon it.
That's right, because my own personal experience didn't seem to correspond with the kinds of romantic images that many others that I met later in life carried with them when they thought about Kathmandu. And I wanted to understand where those romantic, exoticizing images came from.
And they come back from far back in a way, don't they? Because if we're talking about how Nepal became a destination in the first place, it was there in countercultural movements as early as the 19th century.
That's right. And in fact, if you want, you could even go back earlier than that. But I think that the earliest really significant countercultural imaginings of the Himalayas stem from the late 19th century in movements such as Theosophy, which was a movement that was responding to some of the kind of alienating experiences of modernization at the time, and Theosophy had within it kind of anti-industrial, anti-scientific, or it was a movement to try to rescue meaning at a time when science and religion were in conflict, and there was a desire to find something that was a sense of what was being lost, and a desire to find that thing that was being lost in the Western experience, to find that somewhere else where it might still remain. Yeah. And it's that imagining that eventually settled onto the Himalayas as one of the last remaining unknown places.
So part of the sort of general romanticization of the sort of 19th century, the sort of getting away from industry, whether in the Lakeland or, as you say, in Nepal. But this Shangri-La image, going on from the Theosophy, which you talk about as having that moving away from the industrial society to somewhere that is true and basic and real. We also, in the interwar years, there's this book, enormously popular book, James Hilton's book, Lost Horizons. What does he introduce? What does he add to this story of the wonders?
Yeah. In some way, he is a direct continuation of the logic of an earlier countercultural movement that is captured by Theosophy. But it's Hilton who updates that romantic, mystical vision of the Himalayas for, as you said, the interwar period, when, again, there was a deep sense of alienation within Western culture that needed or longed for an other place that was a refuge from the experiences that they were going through at the time. And so, Hilton creates this place, this imagined place, Shangri-La, located somewhere in the Himalayas and populated in much the same way as Madame Blavatsky's Theosophy populated the Himalayas, populated not necessarily with Tibetan or Asian people, but with Europeans who had somehow mystically been able to establish themselves in the Himalayas, where they would retain the esoteric knowledge of the West that might be lost in the experience of modernization.
It probably helped these people. People like Hilton and others, because hardly anybody had been to Nepal. That you could have as many images as you like, because I think up till the first half of the 20th century, tourists have been denied entry.
No, there was no tourism per se in Nepal, and even beyond that in Tibet. Tibet was strangely, relatively more accessible to Europeans, but even so, only a few hundred had ever managed to get into Lhasa. For much of the 19th and early 20th centuries, though, Nepal was officially shut to foreigners as part of an intentional policy on the part of rulers at the time who wanted to keep foreign influence at bay.
And here's the point, and we have to bring in our Russian, our mysterious Russian, a man named Boris, and his role in opening up Nepal. Tell me about him and what he did.
Boris Lasinovich is an amazingly eccentric and interesting character who had a career in dance in Paris and later vaudeville shows around Asia, and eventually found himself in late colonial Calcutta, where he established a very popular nightclub. When the British departed India, new rules made it impossible for Boris to continue his lifestyle of drinking and partying. But in the meantime, he had managed to create a relationship with the King of Nepal, who invited him to come to Kathmandu in 1951 after Nepal was opened to the outside world. And there, Boris and his wife established the Royal Hotel, which became the basis for the first kind of phase of tourism in Nepal.
This was very much an elitist sort of setup, though, quite different from the sort of people like the hippies who are arriving much later, isn't it? I mean, let's just move on to after Boris has set up this hotel, opened the place up to some extent. Let's move on to the arrival of the hippies. There's an article in the English Times in the year 1967 which writes of an international convention of beatniks of the world. Here's an extract.
The Bush Telegraph has sounded from Saigon to Skibbereen, and the bearded ones are on their barefoot way. In fact, a lot of them are here already, tasting the squalid, hemp-enlightened joys of the Tibetan Cat Cafe and the Globe Restaurant, for Kathmandu has become in recent years one of the most popular goals of beatnik travel, a final symbol of withdrawal from the world.
Now, you've talked about some of the impetus behind the images that people had of Nepal in the early days, but what was driving these young people? I mean, had they been reading about it? Why were they going often overland to Kathmandu? What was going on at home that made them want to leave?
Well, I think we need to remember that the counterculture experience is like a pendulum that swings to and fro, and it has its peak moments at various points in history. But one of those was the interwar period when Hilton wrote, but another was, of course, the 1960s, as, again, a new post-war baby boom generation came of age and experienced a kind of alienation from its parents' generation. They, like earlier countercultures, looked for some other place on the earth that they could imagine was not contaminated by the values that their parents represented, that was somehow still pristine.
And they loved it, didn't they? And they wanted to stay for some time. I mean, here's one North American man that you include in your account, an American man writing in the countercultural magazine, The Berkeley Bard, about his experience.
Nirvana for me. It's the most peaceful place I've visited in my life. And it costs $1 a day to live in Nepal, including good amounts of hash. It's so peaceful. I saw 2 policemen walking down the street holding hands in friendship.
Not much sign, though, that these people wanted to integrate with local life, was there?
No, I think in most ways the hippie scene in Nepal was simply a reconstitution of very similar scenes in the West, whether in Greenwich Village or Haight-Ashbury or Soho or Amsterdam. They went to Nepal to re-establish a hippie experience that was becoming increasingly difficult to maintain in the West after 1968, the war on drugs and a general turn against the youth culture. At that point, Nepal becomes even more attractive as a place to hopefully maintain something of that utopic vision that had been fostered during the 60s. It's
extraordinary to think, isn't it? I mean, how were they received? I mean, this is a very strange group, large group of people suddenly arriving. What sense did the locals make of them?
Well, that's a complicated question, and it depends somewhat on your location within Nepali society. I think for older people, looking at these strange, barefoot, bearded, often ragged, dirty people, they tried to fit them into existing categories, and so many people compared them to the Hindu sadhus, the religious renouncers who wandered around doing kind of countercultural things of their own. So some people saw hippies as some kind of species of sadhu, but for young people, young Nepalis were, of course, aware of trends within the world, and young Nepalis tended to see these hippies not as renouncers or seekers, but rather as bearers of Western goods. They saw blue jeans, they saw records and record players, and for them, the hippies were a kind of window onto consumerism in the West and an emerging consumerist youth culture.
You nicely point out how public opinion turned against the hippies, in particular when heroin addiction became something of a problem in Kathmandu, and Nepali youths were becoming addicted to it and dying. The hippies were blamed for this. And there was a sort of decision to get rid of them and replace them with more upmarket tourism. Adventure tourism would replace hippie tourism. And this was Nepal very consciously branding itself as a product for the first time.
That's right. And, at a certain point, the Nepali state realizes the product that they have, the images that people are coming to try to consume. And at that point, the state decides to try to embrace those products and consciously sell them. And at that point, hippies were no longer welcome, but they wanted a new population that had more money and would move through the economy more quickly. And this was embodied in the emergence of adventure tourism.
OK, well, we haven't got time to talk about adventure tourism, but it's a fascinating story of the way in which this particular destination was idealised and how it appealed to so many different sections of society, how many different people who wanted to have a utopian escape. Mark Lichty, thank you very much. And let me also remind to thank Melissa Nisbet for her contribution earlier on. I should deal with your letters. I'm always promising to deal with your letters. I'm always promising to give them some credits. I just want to... Last week's discussion on police culture did prompt this from Alan Borrell. I've given him a B-. I have to grade people. I used to work in universities. I'm always marking things. He says, talking about police culture, he remembers his own brief time in the service in the late 60s. We were lectured hard, he writes, on disciplinary procedures, getting rid of bad eggs. But we all knew that when it came to the crunch, the group would circle the wagons. So would university degrees in policing make a difference? Robert Malloy, solid B+, said no. Here we go again with the university-educated mafia telling us that only those with a degree have the brains to be a police officer. Round here they call you a snob or an elitist. Meanwhile, let's end with a double plus for Stan Getz. Well, I do hope you enjoyed that programme. And if you'd like to hear something similar, why not try downloading the In Our Time podcast at bbc.co.uk/Radio 4.